like delighted, honored, so excited that I have Erika Chung here talking to us. She's going to talk to us about some of her research, all of the extraordinary things she's been doing with comics, pop culture, especially in and around the Asian Americas. And I mention that because, well, Erika is up in Canada, and we're going to learn all about everything. So thanks, Erika, for joining me.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for inviting me. This is really exciting.
So tell me how you got into, well, the stuff that you do. Yeah.
Yeah, so I am a younger millennial. So I very much grew up with the internet. And so it was really around when I was like in middle school, like grade 7, grade 8 was when the internet was full of possibilities. So I was born and raised in a part of Toronto that is very much an immigrant neighborhood, a very Chinese Asian immigrant neighborhood. And so it was never out of the ordinary to, like, I went to a school full of peers who looked like me. So I never really went through the unpacking my own identity and my own heritage until I was a little bit older. But I always craved to find stories where people on the screen not only looked like me, but also sounded like me. And that's because coming from an immigrant neighborhood, a lot of the casual kind of aggressions that can exist are like people judging accents. And so, yeah, the internet, when YouTube first started, was a huge place where friends and I would look for content from a lot of Asian American YouTubers, such as like Wong Fu Productions, Kev Jumba, like Kevin Wu, and Gunarola is Asian Canadian, but it was really very much about like the internet giving us access to finding other creators who had similar experiences to us. And the amazing thing was, it spoke to our experiences of what it's like to be from immigrant families, but we also got to, the content was also about like a humorous reflection on our upbringing, without having to really feel embarrassed about it. And I think that was really meaningful to me as a young person, as a teenager. And so it was like engaging in fandom, engaging in popular culture is something I started really young. I'm one of those people who has a parent, my father, who introduced me to like the original Superman movies and the original Tim Burton Batman films. And so it was really, as I got into a teenager, I was really craving to see, are there stories where both, at the time as a teenager, the way I phrased it was the best of both worlds. And as an adult, I can recognize like what I really wanted to was understand. I no longer wanted to continue doing that process of cross identification. I really wanted a chance to see, what does it mean to be of Asian heritage and not having to necessarily always center a Western perspective. So yeah, like I didn't start with comics once I found YouTube, I found my way to scanlations of Japanese manga and Japanese anime, which was in the early days of those days on the internet, copyright was not as strong as they are now. So that also gave me a chance to experience media and popular culture from a different part of the world. But yeah, it was like I really got into popular culture and like looking at Asian American or Canadian popular culture when I actually started making content on my own, when I started making YouTube videos as a university student, as a hobby. And that was when I got to really connect with other people who came from similar immigrant family backgrounds, who were also, we were trying to understand ourselves and our environments and our neighborhoods through the novels and comics we were reading. And it was really through this new groups of friends that I was introduced to comics. And then at the time I was working a part-time job at a public library, and comics were always coming in and out of the library. And so being constantly around it, I was like, oh, there's so many more options. especially at the time, children's comics or comics for young adults were featuring a lot more characters from different racial heritages. And then I was like, okay, I think there's something here I really want to experience. So it was, yeah, that's generally how I got into everything I'm doing. Is very much a bit of everything.
Really exciting. And I love what you taught, where you say there was a moment for you when it became, in a way that kind of, yeah, this moment when it was no longer, hey, I want to like sort of explore, or I've been asked to explore, say white A-list superheroes and kind of, you know, imagine myself in those spaces. And now it's like, no, I'm going to be looking for the kinds of superheroes that, you know, resonate directly with me. Really powerful moment. Erika, was there a particular kind of, I don't know, film or comic or YouTube or something that was like, wow, during this time?
Oh, I think, I mean, the biggest wow that really got me, that kind of helps explain why I'm doing what I'm doing now, is probably when I found the Miss Marvel comic book series with Kamala Kahn as the character, because um, superhero comics for the longest time felt very intimidating, because if you don't understand or know what the publication sequence is like, it's very confusing about where to begin. And so I had gotten into comics. I was reading comics regularly for maybe a year and a half until I actually found Miss Marvel. And by that point, I think there was at least 2 or 3 volumes of her series out. And the wow moment was really like the first, I think maybe the first 5 pages, where you see her going into the mini mart store, her friend talking to her. But what the biggest part was probably when she's at home. There's a sequence where she realizes her fan fiction story has, I guess, gone viral on the platform she was using, and she rushed downstairs and she tells her mom, like, mom, my story got X amount of hits, you know, it's like trending or something. And her mother completely ignores her and says, I don't care, but I'm calling you down for dinner, so get to the table and wash up. And in that moment, I was like, this is really the first time I was reading and seeing something that was like capturing the essence of what it's like in my own home and a lot of my peers' experience. Because a lot of superhero comics, I guess not I guess, but the convention is, you know, their parents are absent, for whether it's death or just, you know, they're not there, they're not present. And so seeing that she was situated within such a rich context, that was conscious that she was not existing within a siloed bubble, but in fact part of a community and a network, I was like, this hits very close to home. And that was when I was like, okay, it sparked the I want more. I want more, and I'm going to find more somehow, some way.
Love that. And of course, now you're, you know, a PhD candidate, communications and culture, you know, working on your research project, and also doing all sorts of other really amazing things, including the organizational research and DEI for the TCAP that you had mentioned. But so tell me why, like, okay, there's our passion, there's the things that we love in life and that we gravitate toward. And then there's writing books and writing articles and, you know, dedicating time and intellectual like labor to this. Tell me, why research and write on race and gender and pop culture?
I got into this for there's probably a better way of phrasing it, but I'm going to phrase it as it's for me. It's selfishly for me, and for like the things I wish I knew as a young teenager, when looking around myself and questioning, is this all there is to school, to like a professional career as an adult? Is there a chance I can take the things that I love and care about and potentially do more with it? But yeah, I really wanted to look at research race and gender in relation to comics, popular culture, and fandom, because those were the most consistent aspects in my life. And when I decided to go to grad school, I knew I wanted to research something that I deeply cared about, so that I knew graduate studies would be challenging. There would be hurdles, and there would be moments where, you would doubt yourself. But I wanted to know, like, the research project or the topic I'm focusing on is something that will motivate me to push through those really challenging hurdles through grad school. And so as I was going through my undergraduate degree, I was learning more about what representation in media looked like. What does inclusion and gatekeeping, and I wanted to look at like the intersections of race and gender, because again, those are the two points where my personal lived experiences have been from. And so researching race and gender in relation to pop culture has been, it has enabled me to put language to the feelings and experiences I have gone through, and having that language to talk about those experiences have been some of the most relieving and most empowering feelings, to know that the things that I have experienced are not in a vacuum, that there is a history to the things that I've been thinking about and experiencing. And so finding that language has been a really good feeling, a really good experience about understanding what are the underlying forms of history and inequality and institutional influences that are kind of running across. Because over time I realized it's not just me, but at least within my community, sometimes talking about these things openly is difficult. And so I'm hoping that through my research and through people's shared interests in popular culture, we can unpack some of these more difficult topics, such as talking about sexism and racism, and how these things can reinforce one another, so that people don't feel so isolated when we have just moments of discrimination happen.
So powerful that popular culture provided you with that kind of the concepts, the kind of literacy for empowerment, really, as a young woman of color. Let me ask you, Erika, while I've got this slide up, of course, the slide includes Miles and Kamala and Amadeus Cho and Moon Girl and America Chavez and Riri, but it also includes Kim's Convenience Store. And I'm sure you've been asked about this a lot, but God, what a great show. And I know this was the kind of decision of the creator, but this has to be a sad moment for you, right?
Yeah. I like when Kim's Convenience came out, my friends and I were very excited, because there has been some other shows, like local shows in Canada, that feature like Asian cast members. But I think for me personally, knowing that Kim's Convenience is like set in Toronto, is set in my own backyard, like the school Janet goes to, I know where that school is. It's literally up the street from my campus. But I was very excited. And when I heard that the show was canceling, I had actually watched the first 2 seasons, and I had then told myself, okay, I want to binge this because I want to see a resolution between Jung and Appa. I want to see father and son reconcile, because I feel like a lot of families, every family has its troubles and tribulations. No family is perfect, but talking about these things openly is rare, at least within my Chinese community. And so when I heard that the show was canceled, it was, initially it was clouded in a lot of uncertainty, and we're not sure why, but in light of, cast members now speaking and sharing more transparency about the situation, it's disappointing to hear how things panned out, and what, it's disappointing, but not surprising, is what I'm trying to get to. And so I think seeing increasingly more characters of color in the forefront of popular culture, I think it's like the bar will always need to be improved. I don't think just seeing people of color on screen is enough, because we can all reflect on when representation is lacking, or when it is not meaningful, or if it's not well like connected to a larger cultural reality. And so when I heard about like Simu Liu sharing the behind the scenes operations of Kim's Convenience, it's like, again, not disappointing, but not surprising.
What just Erika, if you don't mind, can you share with our audience what that was that you read?
Yeah, so I think the LA Times has written an article covering his comments, but he talked about how as the show was doing better, that his understanding was cast members would eventually have more of a say in the writing and the narrative development of the characters, because they are the ones who are engaging and bringing these characters to life. And so he found it very troubling that the writers' room was still predominantly white writers, and that they were being repeatedly shut out from that process of dialogue with the creative direction and narrative direction of the story. And so and then the question of labor came in, especially when talking about how, as the show was, the show had its success, and I think the numbers were reflecting that. But I think he also mentioned something about like compensation. The pay rate was not improved. And again, I will need to double check his statement, but I think it was like there wasn't a lot of transparency to why. And so, but I think my takeaway from his statement was like, because the cast and him were dedicated to the story they were telling, they wanted to see the story through. And so I think when they started hearing news that maybe the show would not continue, they were hoping maybe new writers would be brought in, writers from the actual heritages or backgrounds that the characters come from.
Yeah, thanks, Erika, for that and for sharing that with our audience. This is we see this repeating itself over and over again, and we really have to keep our eyes wide open when we celebrate, because often on the one hand, there's celebrating that we see, as you mentioned, kind of DEI in front of the camera. But then once we peel things back a little bit, you start to realize working conditions are not optimal. In fact, they can be quite exploitive, and also that the writers in the writing room continue to be completely removed from the experiences that are being told and shared. Tell me about Kamala Kahn. I know this was your kind of first light at the end of the tunnel, but I know you've also written on this. So tell us about give us the elevator pitch version of your academic work on Kamala Kahn.
Yeah, so I wrote a paper on Kamala Kahn. You can find it on it's an open access journal called Panic at the Discourse. I love that. I love that name very much, very similar to a band. But my article was basically examining Kamala Kahn through an intersectional framework, basically explaining why the representation in this comic was meaningful, and why it was successful in incorporating and engaging with the tropes and genre of the superhero genre itself. I basically was explaining how why it was not just commercially successful, but also critically successful in terms of how the comic medium itself was used to present her experience, her narrative, especially the scenes when she first got her superpowers. Is it a dream? Is it a hallucination? It doesn't really matter, but it brings that surrealism into a young person, a young woman of color, reflecting on what are American beauty standards versus what is her understanding of beauty, and how she is processing that in order to be the best, I think, like not just the best version of a superhero, but also the best way she can understand herself and how she can contribute to her community. So I used intersectionality as a way to explain how race and gender in this narrative are interconnected with one another in her story.
Interconnected in the very complex ways that you had just outlined, both in very tense ways, and then finally, would you say that it becomes for her, that's very central to her own journey and coming into her own sense of kind of confidence, not just as a superhero, but as a woman of color?
I think so, because I think one of the most meaning-making scenes in Volume 1, No Normal, is when she goes home and she asks for her mom, do you know where the burkini is? And her mother is like lecturing her about, like, you said you never wear it, why would you want it now? And you see her take it and recreate, make it into something else that not only works for her, but also kind of captures the values that she holds near and dear. And in that scene, it was meaningful to me, at least, because it was like, I don't know what the outside world thinks of me. And at this very moment, it doesn't matter what the outside world thinks anymore. I know what is the right thing I need to do for my community. And so I'm going to give it my best shot. And I think seeing her create her costume was, a demonstration of not just her, her progress in the story, but also like making of herself and creating herself and demonstrating that agency of creating herself.
So important. It's such an important part of this sort of new gen superheroes of color, right? Miles the same way, right? And I think a lot of people really responded so positively to Into the Spider-Verse, precisely because he remakes his costume, per his own identity, right? And that's the real hinge moment, the kind of transformative moment when he can jump off the building with confidence. So women of color in comics, sexuality, gender, race, especially in and around WOC superheroes, but yet there's still so much gatekeeping going on, and the kind of comics canon of the past is still holding on strong. Tell me about your work here, because I know you also work in this space.
Yeah, when I started doing comic studies during my MA, I come from a communications, like a media studies background. And so when I finally took a comic studies course, I realized that the field has its roots in a lot of English lit programs. And so for me, I felt like I was hitting it into the wall, because it was very different from how I was reading and also interacting with comics, because I wasn't just looking at it from a very a more conventional, traditional disciplinary perspective. I was looking at it from like a media studies perspective, which is looking at, what does representation mean in relation to a larger democratic community or democratic sphere. And so what I find very interesting in the field is how there's always people are looking into the past in order to make sense of the present, in hopes of developing the future of the field, so that it is not just rooted in very structural approaches to comics, not just looking at comics as a medium, but also looking at comics as a cultural artifact in a larger sphere, in a larger social and cultural reality. And so I find the gatekeeping part is probably is very disheartening to me, because I believe comic studies itself is very interdisciplinary. I think it invites a lot of interesting perspectives, especially when we use different theories. Like recently at the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics, our conference last week, we had someone from political science present on Logan. And that was such an interesting presentation because it talked about not just the film, but also the political context and of the narrative itself, but also at the time in which the film was released. And so there was this dialogue between theory, between what was represented on screen, but also the time of production. And so when we're looking at women of color in, like, I think in the field, I think a lot of exciting work is happening right now. And I think that's where the practice of making sure who we're citing, who we're referencing in our work is really important to elevate these voices, to show not just the variety, but the breadth and depth of the field itself.
Yeah, and of course you are role modeling that, right? So yeah, thank you for that and your work. Now, of course, your work extends beyond, and when I had mentioned, Asian Americas, we're talking about, of course, North America, Canada, the US, and of course, hemispherically. But there's also Asian diaspora, kind of pop cultural imaginaries coming into our lives. Yeah, what do you make of all of this? I mean, from Crazy Rich Asians, and now, the director there is, just, released in the Heights, to Amadeus Cho, and, tell me, fresh off the boat, where do you insert yourself into all of this, both personally and intellectually, critically?
Yeah, so personally, like I am part of the larger bubble of or larger landscape of the Asian diaspora. My family is from Hong Kong, and my parents they individually immigrated to Canada in the 80s, and so Hong Kong is my parents were born and raised in a time when Hong Kong was a British colony, and they moved to Canada before 1997, which was the handover back to China. And so growing up, I identified using the phrase Chinese Canadian, and there was never a way to really just get away with just saying you're Canadian, because my family and all the aunties and uncles in the neighborhood would correct you. They would always say, you're not just Canadian, you're Chinese Canadian. And of course, these words or these terminologies that we choose to identify ourselves with, it changes over time. And as tensions between, my parents' home city and the larger geopolitics of China, things are tense. But that is where I situate myself, because I am interested in learning more about, personally, the Chinese community in Canada and the rich history that's been here since the late 1800s. And so as part of my personal journey, I'm to inform my studies about Asian America, or Asian Canadian representation in comics and popular culture. I'm digging into that history in order to inform myself, to understand where do these stereotypes come from, tracing the history of these stereotypes, such as where does the idea of the model minority comes from? How does that connect back as far back as the Yellow Peril, or the few big starlets of golden age Hollywood, tracing back because I truly do believe the past informs our present. And so, Crazy Rich Asians was this massive film that came out a few years ago, but I was torn on the film, mainly because it presents, when we look at it in terms of when we add in the element of socioeconomic class, things get a lot more complicated, because a lot of people as part of the Asian diaspora a lot of people are still working very hard, making ends meet, paycheck to paycheck. And so it was, like you said earlier, as much as there is a celebratory element to find joy in, there is also for me, it's always about thinking very carefully through these celebrations, not to say I can not to like cut myself off from that positivity, but when I looked closely at the model minority myth, I could see how it's been perpetuated not just in media and popular culture, but also within my own community. Because the model minority myth, I like to describe it as like a double-edged sword, because there's a certain set of positive characteristics that, you know, no one is going to want to kick away or deny, but at the same time, there's the flip side of this long lineage of how it can be framed as, you know, immigrants can be framed as these threats to North America, or to these ideas of what is Canada and what is America. And so I always, if we're going to say Asians are not a monolith, then it means having to think deeply about not just what we see on screen, but also about adding those elements of class and, as mentioned earlier, like gender and sexuality. Because Crazy Rich Asians is still centered on a very straight couple, whereas it's like, what about members of our community who are queer, and that narrative is going to be different from what is like presented from something like as big as Crazy Rich Asians. So yeah, that's how that's how the personal informs my intellectual journey in learning about like very much the history. Like the moment it wasn't until I got into university that I learned what the true history behind Chinatowns were. Because in Toronto we have a Chinatown, and it's praised as like a heritage site. You know, it's part of the story of multiculturalism and diversity. But when I finally learned about the actual history of like Chinatowns and how they were, you know, specific parts of cities that were allocated for early Chinese immigrants that were brought over to work on railways, it was like, this is why, as much as there is a celebratory tone, I think it's always worth to peel back and look a little deeper, in order to inform ourselves about how we want our community to engage with the larger city sphere, province or state, and ultimately the larger political landscape of our respective homes.
Wow, so incredible, Erika. Thank you. Model minority, desirability, undesirable, vulnerability, you know, all of those things that, you know, Asian Americas, Asian diaspora peoples experience in many ways, sharing with Latinx's, right? You know, Asian America's superheroes and Comicsgate. Now this gets back to kind of the gatekeeping, but here, of course, it's toxic, right? And you know, when we aren't accepted as a desirable subject, right, safe for the kind of whiteness that exists out there, white masculine presence, there's this pushback. Tell me about this.
Yeah, Comicsgate was it was this massive backlash against I think a comics industry and a comics community that was growing increasingly. I don't want to give it too much credit, but like there was significant portions of the industry and the community that were growing socially and culturally conscious, and was, you know, more and more people were asking questions about like, well, what does it mean if we include an Asian character? Like, are we going to stick with these? Are we going to focus the series on just a lot of action, which we can get a lot of stereotypes and cliches around martial arts involved, or you know, do you invest time to create narratives that are more rooted in an informed context? And so Comicsgate, yeah, I believe I'm part of my doctoral research is looking at Comicsgate and trying to trace their history about how they started, because it started very informally, and over time they've had a couple people who act as like unofficial leaders and spokespersons who align themselves very publicly with this movement, this harassment movement, I should say. So yes, Comicsgate harassed, Chelsea Kane, I believe, when she had a series with Marvel Comics, and then I believe they harassed a group of women editors at Marvel as well. And so yeah, it's very jarring to see something like this play out. I remember when they initially, one of their initial I don't want to say controversies, but one of their initial harassment campaign, I remember witnessing it on Twitter myself unfolding. I was witnessing a lot of people respond or react to what they were doing, and it really is a moment of pause to think about why engage in a space that is hostile towards you because of because of who you are, and I think that is something that is harder to speak generally, because everyone is going to make everyone have we navigate and negotiate our own relationships with the kinds of narratives we want to consume and engage with, and in spaces we want to give our energy and presence to. And so, at least for myself personally, when Comicsgate unfolded, it was a sign for myself. I did double check my accounts. I did double check what videos I was posting. I didn't want to fall into self-censorship, but because my YouTube was a space where I talked about books and comics I read, I was very mindful of what kind of reception I would be getting when posting on the internet. And that's still a general practice I uphold, because it does feel like sometimes it feels like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I feel, and that is, and that I don't think that a group of hateful individuals should have that over others whatsoever.
Yeah. Very often the weak go to these extreme places of violence and propaganda and attempting to instill fear, precisely because it's a kind of last ditch moment, right? The fragility of that really kind of in its last gasp. I'm so glad that on the one hand, yes, you're mindful because you have to protect yourself right now. You are young and you have a big career ahead of you. But on the other hand, also not giving it any energy beyond the important energy of understanding it and inviting others to understand it. So important. Fandom is another, you mentioned this already, race and gender and the future of fandom, but fandom, yeah, tell me, that's a big part of your work.
Yeah, I've been engaging in different fan communities since I was a teenager because of internet access, and more like right now, the community the fandom I'm most active is probably like the booktube community, YouTubers who basically share like their reading habits and like book recommendations, comic recommendations. So that's the space that I've actually participated in most actively, where I've created my own videos, and in light of like I said, of at least in hopes of like taking some precautionary steps, I've moved my activities now mostly over to Instagram. But yeah, like I think the future of fandom is, I think there will like more and more people are, there's a certain segment of fans. Again, it's hard to speak. It's impossible to talk about everyone under a giant umbrella because there is so much variety and distinction between different online fan communities. But I do believe there is a certain segment of fans who are grappling with these ideas of anti-racist practices and how to implement them within their own spaces and communities, and the kind of tension and backlash people can receive when trying to engage in that kind of dialogue, which is kind of why my research partly also focuses on Comicsgate, because it was this large backlash to a community of people who were engaging in critical reflection. And so like the thing I love most about as a teenager when I was getting into fandom was how people were reinterpreting characters based on their own kind of positionality in relation to race and gender, whether it's like through cosplay. There are some amazing cosplay Black cosplayers whose Instagram pages and Twitter pages are like, the amount of time and labor they put into their costuming and makeup is amazing. It's also a place where people engage critically with narrative. And so what the future of fandom looks like is, I think, increasingly people are aware that fandom is not just stuck to North American media products. I think K-pop is probably one of the most timely and best examples of like an international reaching fandom that is not predominantly coming from an American perspective or a Western perspective more largely. I think the rise in there's a lot of Chinese historical dramas now that are getting a lot of because they're on Netflix. There's also growing fandoms around that. And so I think increasingly people are questioning how much masculinity and how much whiteness is centered in our fan practices and in our fandoms generally, and questioning how to decenter that. But again, that is only potentially a small portion of fans. There is still a very, I think, the idea of fandom or like engaging in fan communities has become more mainstream in the last 10 years. And so looking at how casual fans reflect on, race and gender is going to be is something to consider as well. And I think that's why people are still very invested or interested in like these big major productions from like Marvel and Disney at large, really, because they have such a big reach. And so I was very interested in what the conversations were when Falcon and the Winter Soldier was released. This idea of a Black Captain America. And there were some very interesting conversations, but I think the future of fandom is it's in flux and there is tension. And I think there are people who hope to hold each other accountable, but that's not without ruffling feathers and making sure sometimes you're going to have to take a break, put your phone down, go outside, look at the sun or something, because fandom is ultimately part of our larger reality and our larger culture. It's not these conversations about inequality, about discrimination, about hate. They're not just isolated to the internet or to fan communities. They're part of a larger conversation that is existing within our own governments and own public spaces as well.
Wow. Yeah. I'm so glad you alerted us to the both kind of professional, if you will, and casual fandoms, but the kind of globality of that, and then also the sort of significant presence of the kind of anti-racism at work there, and it's kind of it being the future. Teaching and learning by other means, and you already brought up the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics that you had last week. Is this for you? I mean, in a way, yeah, you're in a program, you're getting your PhD, you have advisors. I wonder if, things like CSSC are our spaces of learning, of dissemination of knowledge in and around comics. Maybe they are our laboratories, our universities, right? Tell me about your sense of this.
Yeah, for this, like the very first time I ever presented at the CSSC, and I had informed some friends and colleagues that I would be presenting at a big at a conference. I had people like caution me. They're like, because my paper was focused at the time, it was on Miss Marvel as well. I had people caution me. They're like, if you get difficult questions, or if someone asks a difficult question during the Q&A, these are some things to keep in mind. But I've actually had, it was the actual opposite. People at both the Comic Studies Society, which is where this photo on the screen is from, and CSSC, people have been very supportive and receptive. And yeah, every time I go to one of these conferences with a paper, I always walk away with more food for thought. It's also given me like, recently when I presented my paper on Superman Smashes the Klan, I walked away with thinking, yeah, I need to start thinking, I've looked at the history now, I've looked at how it kind of plays out in the present, how it informs us, but now I need to consider what are the next steps, what is the future, why are we engaging in reevaluating past comics or past stereotypes? What does it mean for representation, or what does it mean for a cultural imaginary going forward? And so I think conferences, especially in light of the pandemic, because we've had to move online, I think they serve as another space for comic scholars, and especially like peers like mine, graduate students who are working on ideas that may not fit necessarily neatly in disciplinary parameters, but I think I have learned much from my peers, not just within my program, but in conference spaces like the Comics Studies Society and the Canadian Society for the Study of Comics. They've been, it's, as a graduate student, it's great to receive positive feedback, but it's also great when there is support and encouragement to expand upon the work. And I think it's definitely like, for someone who did not exactly have like a formal course, like I took one course on comic studies, but otherwise a lot of it was research that I took myself with my professors and the committee. But yeah, going to these conferences has been a very meaningful space to explore and expand ideas, to workshop them too.
Love it. Yeah, I feel the same way. So important, these spaces. And they don't have the institutional kind of almost the oppressive weight of, long histories of the disciplinary aspect of departments, right? We can kind of move like little Hobie cats and really get things done and learn and share. Where are you seeing, you were just pointing to kind of the future of fandom. Where is the vitality in pop culture buying about Asian Americas today for you, Erika?
I think the online space is still very rich with grassroots and small creators and collectives coming together to create both art, film, and popular culture by and for Asian Americas today. I wrote, sorry, I'm just gonna look here because I have a couple examples I wanted to share. And like, as a tangent, like web comics as well is a very rich growing space, both on Instagram and on platforms such as like Webtoons, where you have creators from like different parts of the world, different parts of Asia and North America, and again, different parts of the world coming together to create new comics, new narratives. But so online spaces, I believe, is still very rich, but also local community spaces. And so for this moment, I can only speak for my positionality in Toronto. And that is like local scene festivals are still very rich with local creators. The Pin and Patch Show is another place where a lot of local illustrators are present. And I think the Toronto Reel as in like a film reel, Real Asian International Film Festival is a pretty big event in the local calendar here, about showing films by Asian creators, but also by the Asian diaspora community and showing narratives from multiple, like showing narratives and experiences from different perspectives of the very broad Asian community. And so I think when we think about going into the future, it is, I don't think we can ever undercredit, we cannot undercredit nor underestimate the grassroots organizations and local community work, because that is where a lot of, I think, BIPOC creators broadly are, get opportunities to build skills, build connections, and start something like a portfolio. So I think local communities still play a massive role in how popular culture is going to be shaped, even though it seems very large and international and global.
Beautiful. Thank you, Erika. Thank you, Erika, for sharing your experiences, your incredible wisdom, your knowledge, your expertise with pop culture of the Asian Americas, comics, film, zines, YouTube spaces. Thank you, Erika.
No problem. Thank you so much for the time and for speaking with me.